Welcome, everybody. Excited to get started. My name is Craige. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And welcome to our Friday class. We get to bring in amazing experts from around the country to talk about the Constitution. Today's class is going to be moderated and run by Jeff Rosen, our President and CEO. Hi, Jeff. Excited to have you here. And our VIP guest is Professor Michael Gerhardt, who is not only one of my favorite teachers, he's a huge friend of the Constitution Center. He's one of our scholars. He's helped us build our educational programs. He helps us build our exhibits. He does so many of our teacher workshops, but he's also one of my favorite primary sources because he has firsthand experience with impeachment trials. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to start the conversation with Michael.
Thank you so much, Curry. Happy Friday. Hello, friends. And Michael, so wonderful to see you. Welcome to our Friday class.
Thanks. It's great to see you.
So excited to talk about the presidency. You've cast so much light on our understanding of the presidency and the Constitution with your wonderful books on Lincoln's mentors, your book on the constitutional legacy of the forgotten presidents, and your writings about impeachment and presidential power more generally. I'd love to start in the obvious place, and that is with Lincoln. That's your most recent book. Give us a sense of what Lincoln's constitutional legacy was and how he transformed the presidency from the one that the founders envisioned.
Well, how much time do we have?
I know, of course. And just to preview what I think would be really wonderful for our conversation. After you've talked about Lincoln, maybe I'll go back and ask you to talk about Washington and how he kind of solidified the founders' understanding of the presidency, and then maybe ask you to highlight a couple of less known presidents, both forgotten and less forgotten, and their changed understanding of the presidency. But we should begin with Lincoln, so let's start there.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and hello to everybody on the NCC team and family. So Lincoln's constitutional legacy is, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, that any president has ever had. It was an extraordinary, slightly more than 4 years that he had as president. Sometimes we forget that. It seems like he was there longer. He was barely there for more than a term before, unfortunately, he was killed. But before he died, Lincoln had overseen enormous changes in not just constitutional understanding, but in how the Constitution worked really on the ground. To begin with, Lincoln saw the Constitution as an inviolable contract, that cemented the relationship between all states as part of the Union. There was no voluntary departure. So he was the second president to address secession seriously, but he was the first president to deal with an active rebellion against the United States brought by the leaders of a number of different states. And so he really established the longstanding precedent in this country that states are bound to the Union. They may not leave voluntarily. And that at the same time, the Union is a nation. One of the big questions in constitutional law up until Lincoln was president was, what did it mean to be part of the United States? And Lincoln really, perhaps more than any other president before him, maybe even since, had a very evolved sense of what the Constitution meant for this country as a nation. And its central components were the guarantees that were set forth in the Declaration of Independence. He saw the Declaration of Independence as stating the ideals for the Constitution, and the Constitution sought to implement those ideals, primarily equality and liberty. No president before Lincoln had really talked about those concepts either separately or, more importantly, together. And Lincoln also oversaw what we come to understand as the second founding. This was the reconstruction of the country and the reconstruction of the Constitution. A Constitution that some people thought legitimized slavery. Lincoln thought it also legitimized the end of slavery. It legitimized federal power to end slavery, which is a very bold and important advancement in constitutional understanding. And of course, presidential power was central to all of that. For Lincoln, he consolidated the power of the presidency more so than any of his predecessors, including Andrew Jackson, and set the stage, I think, for not just a radical reconstruction of the country through the adoption of the Reconstruction Amendments, but a radically new understanding of presidential power to defend equality and liberty.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to Lincoln's constitutional legacy. We've just had a series of programs on Lincoln and the Constitution, ranging from a discussion with Sean Wilentz and Kate Mazur about the Gettysburg Address, and then a great program on Lincoln and the Constitution with Noah Feldman, Michael Burlingham, and Diana Shobe. And one big topic that came up in those debates was the Constitution a pro-slavery Constitution or not? And was Lincoln breaking the Constitution, or was he perfecting it? Do you have a view on that very hotly contested question?
So Lincoln himself, of course, had to deal with that first question. And that was a big challenge for him, to deal with a big question of whether the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And he took a very strong stance against that understanding. He actually saw the Constitution as establishing the limits of slavery and really empowering the federal government ultimately to come down on the side very strongly against slavery. And so Lincoln, the other question that's connected to this is the one you just asked, which is, was Lincoln perfecting the Constitution or really breaking it in trying to bring all the might of the federal government on the side against slavery? I think Lincoln was largely perfecting the Constitution. I don't think he was breaking it per se. Lincoln was a lawyer to begin with, and thought much like a lawyer and putting the lawyerly cases together. So he had to work with what he thought were established principles. And what Lincoln tried to do was extend them to the current crisis he had to face and ultimately solve. And in doing that, I think he ended up reconstructing the Constitution itself.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, let's now go back to Washington. You've just told us that one of Lincoln's central constitutional contributions was to establish the unconstitutionality of secession and the indissolubility of the Union. Was that obvious during Washington's presidency, and what were Washington's constitutional contributions?
Well, of course, Washington's constitutional contributions are enormous. And so to begin with, he was, by acclamation, of course, the first president of the United States. And so everything, and this is virtually quoting Washington, everything Washington did, he understood was set a precedent for the presidency. So Washington really introduces all of us to what the functions and powers and even limits of the presidency were. That's an enormous constitutional legacy that Washington put together. Washington didn't have to deal with secession so much as he had to deal with trying to ensure that the system worked. The very system in the Constitution that set up a separation of powers, a distribution of powers, as well as federalism, the relationship between the federal government and states. Washington saw his role as really making that complicated system work on an everyday basis. And he largely succeeded. He did it because I think people, particularly in government by and large, were supportive of Washington. And around the country, as young as it was, there was an understanding, of course, that Washington would be a wise and careful president, and he was. But Lincoln's vision was ultimately that of a very strong federal government, which is a radical change from the Articles of Confederation and the world that preceded the Constitution. And a strong federal government meant that Congress had to have strong powers and the presidency had to have strong powers. And Washington himself assembles the first Supreme Court of the United States. So everything that's going on in those first 10 years of the Republic, Washington is really kind of shaping that, what's happening and shaping the path of the country.
Thank you for that. Well, I have in front of me your great book, The Forgotten Presidents, and friends in the chat, it would be wonderful if you'd read Professor Gerhardt's book, because it teaches us so much about how even less well-known presidents have a significant constitutional legacy. The first one you mentioned is Martin Van Buren, but maybe before we go to him, since we want to get the highlights, do you want to say anything about the constitutional legacy of Andrew Jackson?
Sure. I mean, that's an important question, of course. So before Lincoln comes into office, the only president before Lincoln that was elected to 2 terms was Andrew Jackson. And that was more than 3 decades before Lincoln was president. So the country had gone through a long period of time during which Jackson was thought to be sort of the last powerful president, so to speak. And Lincoln saw himself as really challenged by Jackson's legacy. And Jackson's legacy was multifold. To begin with, he was the first president to issue a proclamation against secession. This surprised a lot of people, but Jackson came down very strongly against secession, as well as against any sort of attempt to fragment the United States. And secondly, Jackson was very much a proponent of a strong presidency. He wielded the veto more strongly than other presidents before him. He saw a great deal of discretion on the president's side to veto laws, even that might be constitutional, but that he just simply disagreed with. Jackson was also very strong in terms of making appointments. He was very strong in trying to reshape the Supreme Court of the United States. And of course, he was very strong in trying to defend a fairly limited federal government. So when Lincoln comes into office, or later presidents come into office, they're all doing it measured against Jackson's performance as well as his philosophy. And as Jackson's second vice president, Martin Van Buren has the task of extending the Jacksonian legacy. It's not going to work very well for Van Buren. He faces the first great economic downturn and he makes a mess of it. And that pretty much dooms his presidency.
Fascinating. Do you want to highlight any of the intervening presidents, Harrison, Tyler, or Taylor, before we
Sure.
Lincoln?
So some of the intervening presidents, I think, turn out to be important for the story that's going to get told later, particularly the story about Lincoln. Because Lincoln had begun his political career as a Whig. That was the opposition party to Jefferson's party. It was a party that believed in stronger national power. And so Lincoln, politically, before he became president, had supported William Henry Harrison, the first Whig to be elected president. He supported the second Whig to be elected president, Zachary Taylor. And he saw them, to some extent, as models for himself. What I think ultimately made Lincoln rather unique is that he could see things from these lesser known presidents that he would borrow, such as a belief in a stronger national government. And he could see things in Jackson, whom he opposed politically, but he could see the advantage and the importance of Jackson's belief in a strong presidency, which Lincoln himself would assume he needed to be strong, of course, to be able to push back that rebellion.
One of the many significant contributions of your book, Lincoln's Mentors, is to note that Jackson himself was one of Lincoln's most significant mentors.
Yes, and Lincoln basically says that. It's often thought because Lincoln was a Whig, which was the party put together by Henry Clay, Jackson's great nemesis, that somehow Lincoln would always hate Jackson. He certainly never voted for Jackson. He didn't support him politically while Lincoln was coming up the ranks, so to speak, before he becomes president. But when Lincoln becomes president, that's the start of the Civil War. And Lincoln understands that many of the people calling themselves Republicans had been Democrats who had adored Jackson. So Lincoln has one portrait in the Oval Office, or it wasn't Oval yet, but in the White House office at that time. And that was the portrait of Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. And he would bring people over to the portrait, particularly former Democrats, like Francis Blair and the younger Blairs, and say, look, I'm going to follow his example. He's my model. It's a remarkable thing for Lincoln to do that, but he's doing it in part because it's politically helpful to him, but it's also important symbolically and in practice that he's going to follow Jackson's model of being a tough president, an unbending president when it comes to pushing back that rebellion.
Wow. Lincoln also stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861, as we note in the Civil War exhibit, which you helped us launch, and said, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. I'd rather be assassinated on this spot, he said, than abandon the principles of the Declaration. An amazing, prescient, poignant statement, but also surprising because we think of Jefferson as the states' rights guy, not the Union guy. Why was Jefferson such an inspiration to Lincoln?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very, very important event, when Lincoln is introducing himself to the country, really. on his path from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. Most of the country doesn't know who Lincoln is. There were bigger names, bigger figures who were presidential candidates. And this lawyer from Illinois, a very far western state, ends up being president. So the words he's choosing as he makes the path from Springfield to Washington are important. And he's really acknowledging in that speech that he is not just a follower of Henry Clay, who was the founder of the Whig Party and the person that Lincoln had most admired in Congress and an opponent of Jackson, but it was acknowledging Clay's own influence. Clay had been an early follower of Jefferson, but not just politically, but more importantly, ideologically. So Jefferson had crafted the Declaration of Independence, and in that great document, he had written those words that all men are created equal. That was not just rhetoric for Clay, and it was not just rhetoric for Lincoln. So Lincoln is trying to demonstrate that that idea that put forth in the Declaration of Independence was one he was going to champion as president. That's basically what he's doing at Independence Hall. That's what he's going to do later as president of the United States. And no president had really done that before Lincoln.
Fascinating. Campbell from our chat wants to know, what would you say is Lincoln's greatest global legacy?
That's a really great question. What first comes to mind is his leadership in trying to end slavery. Slavery was itself being dismantled in different parts of the world, though sometimes it can be overstated how much slavery was being really dismantled. He saw among his own models and mentors the British leaders who were trying to work against slavery and to ensure its end in the British Empire. So I think when Lincoln aligned himself with that movement, that was something that people around the world perceived. And I think that became his greatest legacy internationally.
Fascinating. Okay, we have a bunch of post-Lincoln forgotten presidents leading up to the really well-known ones who are widely recognized to have changed executive power post-Lincoln, and that would be Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But the forgotten ones in between them include Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison. What would you like to tell us about their constitutional contributions?
Well, sometimes the contributions are positive and sometimes they're negative. So Cleveland is a very interesting president because he, as everybody knows, he's the only president who serves 2 non-successive terms. And he's a very different person in the second term than he was in the first term. In the first term, he's much more deferential to the legislature, to Congress. In the second term, he's incredibly opposed to Congress and vetoes over 400 laws, almost a record number really in a single term. And he's battling Congress really for supremacy of the federal government. And it's because of Cleveland's leadership in the second term that Woodrow Wilson, later as a political scientist, will say that Cleveland's the first modern president. And the idea that a president would dictate to Congress what national policy should be was a rather new idea post-Civil War. Lincoln had helped lay some of the groundwork for that. Cleveland helps it further. And by the time we get to the 20th century, we then get presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, who are very happy to be dictating policy to Congress and so on. Other presidents like Benjamin Harrison become models for really what not to do. Harrison was not a uniter. He was somebody who was arrogant to a fault, had disdain for Congress. And what one learns from the presidency is, well, a president like that's not going to be able to work with Congress. And Harrison was unable to work with Congress and have any real traction there. And so other presidents will learn from that they've got to build bridges to Congress if they want to get things done at the national level.
Fascinating. All right, I think now is the time for me to ask about Theodore Roosevelt. He insisted that the president was a steward of the people who could directly channel popular will, which was a very different vision than that of Washington, and is credited by many for having introduced what became what Arthur Schlesinger would call the imperial presidency. Tell us about Roosevelt's contributions.
Well, so, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, deserves a program on its own. It's a remarkable career. He is the surprise vice president under McKinley. And then, of course, McKinley is killed. And suddenly this very young, exuberant person, Teddy Roosevelt, excuse me, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. And he adopts the philosophy you just mentioned as a steward, really for the nation. What Roosevelt's saying is he is in the office that has to lead everything, that he's going to be the one dictating the terms to Congress. And his only limit, the only limit he recognizes at all is not really constitutional. His only limit is what the people will allow or support. That's a very bold idea, not just for Teddy Roosevelt, but for every president since. And the thing about Teddy Roosevelt is he had limitless energy. So he was all over the place. He was checking in with the administration. He was almost micromanaging it in various respects. He was also sort of pushing the Justice Department in those days against antitrust. He was really becoming a model the country was to some extent having to get used to for what an exuberant, energetic, and bold and innovative president, what that president would look like. So Teddy Roosevelt gets tremendous credit, and I think this is part of his legacy, for ushering in this sort of new, stronger presidency. He's ushering it into the 20th century. And other presidents will have to catch up with him rather than so much, they can't get ahead of him because nobody's more energetic than Teddy Roosevelt proved to be.
Thanks for that. Our friend Victoria Williams asks, in the modern era presidents, who do you think the lens of history will be viewed in a more favorable light than during their term, and who will be looked at as the president who was lauded at the time, but history will look back and view them as not really having done as well as was accepted at the time?
Well, that's a tremendously hard question. And so I think one president who keeps getting more credit than he got at the time, it was Harry Truman. As you well know, Truman comes in accidentally, so to speak. But he's got to oversee a presidency at a very difficult moment in history, not just through the end of the Second World War, but through the initial parts of the Cold War. And changes are going on domestically within the United States as well. And Truman, it turns out, is very adept at not just addressing the changes going on in society. He's the first president to order the desegregation of the military, for example. He has to be adept internationally, following Franklin Roosevelt. And Truman is able to succeed by and large doing all that. Not necessarily with a lot of political support, but he keeps beating the odds. He wins election in his own right. He steps down of his own accord later. But I think what people learn reading about Truman later is how effective he was, much more effective than people recognized at the time he was president. I think a president who we might consider to be somewhat overrated, if that's really what the question's leading to. This will only make me unpopular by picking somebody who's overrated. I think to some extent, I hate to say this, John Kennedy may be one of those. He ends up being really highly rated, but he's not president for very long. And if you look at Kennedy's record during that time period, the 1,000 days, he's making big mistakes along the way. Not everything is successful. So I don't want to take anything too much away from Jack Kennedy. He was, among other things, it turns out, a great orator, great rhetorician as president. He had help, of course, from Ted Sorensen and others. That's an important thing. But he's also, his mistakes, I think, to some extent, haven't yet caught up with him. Yeah.
Thanks for that. As it turns out, Victoria had exactly the same thought. So you're both on the same wavelength, and that consensus must be important. So we'll definitely take it on board. Lots of great questions coming up, including Emily Fulton says, I've heard in reality Lincoln was not as good as we're taught. Is this true to any extent? And can you give any examples?
I can appreciate that question. I mean, one of the things that happens with Lincoln, and it's very understandable that this would happen, is because he dies really as a martyr, we don't fully know what he would have achieved as president. Also, what we have to keep in mind is that Lincoln largely sees himself as a failed president up until about August of 1864. He is fully expecting to lose the election to George McClellan, a person that was quite detestable in a number of different respects. And it had been an unsuccessful head of the Union Army under Lincoln. And so Lincoln is expecting that he just can't remain popular because the war is kind of slipping away. The Confederacy isn't giving up. It's being stubbornly successful a number of different ways. And it's only when the war starts turning the corner, so to speak, in late August of 1864, that suddenly Lincoln's popularity begins to kind of rebound. So if we look at things from Lincoln's perspective, you could make up a story that Lincoln's really not being all that successful. He's having to deal with a war effort, which is a bit of a mess. More than 8 different people he puts in charge of the Union Army. And all that could tell a story of somebody who's not being very successful. But things oftentimes get judged by how they end, not so much how they began. And with Lincoln, by the time we get to the end, premature as it was, things are not just turning around on the war front. He has achieved a lot of very important things domestically. For example, the Transcontinental Railroad. There are a lot of victories that Lincoln has, paper money, that all these victories happen on Lincoln's watch, and they are going to take root and they're going to be enduring.
Wonderful. I have so many more questions, of course, and there are a few more in the Q&A box, but I think I better turn it back to Craige for our final questions.
Okay.
I just want to first say, I appreciate how humble you are when we're so good and ready to pick on people, but you really just teach us about history and the humility and the kindness that you have to say about even JFK. You said that in the nicest way possible. So thank you for that lesson as I'm picking JFK apart over here with Vicky. It was really really interesting the way you kind of laid that out. So I appreciate your ability to do that as a historian and a scholar. One couple questions, and I know everybody wants to hear your stories about impeachment. But before we get in there, I just wanted to know your thoughts on Eisenhower, because sometimes I feel like Eisenhower has a big impact on so many major shifts in our country. And I don't know if he always gets the, either positive or negative comments as much as he should.
And it's a very fair question. I think Eisenhower probably largely gets the credit he deserves from historians, which, by the way, is a pretty positive rating. If you look at the ratings, for example, C-SPAN more recently, Eisenhower scores very well. He scores very well on almost every presidential rating. And I think that reflects a growing awareness that Eisenhower actually was very effective as president. He was somewhat lackluster, but that was by choice. There's a wonderful book about his presidency called The Hidden Hand Presidency by Fred Greenstein, and who was a great presidential scholar. And that book really kind of explains that Eisenhower was much more effective than people realize because he wasn't always out front taking credit. Remember, he was a very successful general. And it couldn't have been a more difficult time. And as a very successful general, he understood generals don't have to always be out front. And they aren't always going to be the ones that win the war. Other people are fighting it for them. Well, Eisenhower took this into the presidency. And over the course of 2 terms, he's rather effective on almost every front you could perceive. And that's why he ends up getting, I think, a lot of credit. It's maybe because he's not colorful, as let's say some later presidents may be, that people may kind of take him for granted. But I think he is, constitutionally speaking, very, very successful.
That's awesome. I know a lot of our students know him because he has really good commercials. And like, that's how they're first introduced to Ike. And catchy. So good marketing team around him at least. So
Right.
That's nice. So the impeachment, can you tell us, you've been on 2 impeachment trials, parts of the president, we talked all week about where in the Constitution does the president get power? And also, what are the checks and balances around the president? And impeachment was a big topic of the week. And you have such amazing stories on this front. So can you tell us your personal experiences with impeachment?
Yeah, we can all play psychotherapist right now for me. Well, I had to confess, my first experience with presidential impeachment happened when I was in high school. And that was when Richard Nixon faced impeachment. So I am so to speak, a child of Watergate. And can remember seeing its hearings, which were televised through, again, while I was in high school and later early on in college. And so that was an extraordinary thing at the time, to be able to see and witness the investigation into a presidency, which took more than really 2 years. It's hard to imagine we could have any such thing now, but we had it then. And people actually watched the hearings. People were actually educated by the hearings. People, I think, were not as invested, tribally, so to speak, in the presidency then as they might be more today. And what we generally saw, and this is how historians tell the story, what we generally saw was how the system worked against Nixon. Impeachment was effective in getting Nixon's attention and in uncovering the extent of his corruption and ultimately forcing his resignation. If we fast forward 20 years to then Bill Clinton's impeachment, when I had the honor of being a joint witness before Congress and then later working as Jeff was, as I recall, and later working at CNN during that same time period, we could begin to see some shifts, not just in the presidency, but in how effective impeachment might turn out to be. One of the things that has developed between the time of Richard Nixon and the time of Bill Clinton is the presidency is not just accruing more power. As Jeff pointed out early on, Nixon was tagged with the imperial presidency, which was thought to be a negative. That was thought to be sort of a negative thing, a president who was overly powerful. But by the time we get to Clinton's presidency, I think the imperial presidency is beginning to take on a shine. It's becoming a little more attractive. It's becoming a little more appealing, partly because people hate Congress, it's rather ineffective, and because if you want to get things done, it's usually going to be the president that gets them done rather than any other branch. Teddy Roosevelt taught us that, for example. Franklin, his cousin, taught us that as well. Lincoln taught us that. And Bill Clinton turns out to be a rather popular president. So we're learning something about impeachment at that point. And that is, up until Clinton, we don't have any president who actually faced impeachment who gets convicted. Andrew Johnson was enormously unpopular. He obstructed Reconstruction, but he avoids conviction in a trial. Bill Clinton's popularity extends, it grows during his impeachment trial. So even though he did lie under oath and committed perjury, a federal judge found him liable and guilty for that later. So Clinton, in a sense, doesn't get off scot-free. There was a question early on about why does Clinton get off scot-free? He's not convicted in his impeachment trial, but a federal judge later suspends his law license and finds him guilty of perjury. So, and that sticks, that conviction sticks. It's not ever been erased. So I wouldn't call that getting off scot-free, so to speak. And what we're beginning to learn with Clinton's presidency is that if you can keep your political party together, unified, and you have the numbers, you can beat impeachment. And this lesson will be well learned by Donald Trump, not just once, but twice. And so it becomes a very different story as we follow it through. By the time we get to Trump, we know he's going to be acquitted in the first trial. We are pretty sure he's going to be acquitted in the second trial, though there are historic numbers of senators from his party breaking in favor of conviction. That's never happened to a president before. So Trump's acquitted both times, but in the second trial, it's by he has the legacy of having had the largest number of senators vote for his conviction of any president in American history, particularly presidents who faced impeachment trials. Nevertheless, we remain enamored of a powerful presidency. And I think Donald Trump was especially enamored with a strong presidency. He took the imperial presidency as a badge of honor, not as a badge of corruption. Though, of course, some alleged he was corrupt. That was the focus of the first trial, and it was a reflection of a lot of popular opinion since, may in fact be a reason why he loses re-election later.
And that begs for the follow-up question of, in your opinion, because of the way we have set this up at like the public and seeing this imperial presidency, is that impeachment not a viable check on the system anymore? This is when our students ask this on Wednesday class, and it's a really good question, and there's both sides to this, but you make me want to ask it.
Well, it's a question that keeps me up late at night. I've come to think that impeachment is not as effective as it could and should have been, particularly against presidential misconduct. And this is because we've learned 3 times, Clinton once and Trump twice, that a president, again, if he keeps his political party unified, has the numbers to beat impeachment. The constitutional threshold for conviction and removal in an impeachment trial is at least 2/3 of the Senate. That's a very hard threshold to meet anytime. And it becomes particularly hard if a president's constituency is cemented, solid, and unified. And then in that case, what we've seen is the presidency will tend to prevail. This is because the presidency has the bully pulpit. The presidency has the opportunity to grant favors to different members of Congress and others. The presidency also is the institution of government that's most watched by the American people. And what we're discovering is it's really hard to get at a president's misconduct. Very, very hard to get at through Congress. And that means other checks have to work. And life gets a lot more complicated as a result of all this dynamic. As presidential power has grown, presidential immunity really to being forced out of office through impeachment becomes a reality. Where are we going to look for checks on presidential misconduct? One natural thing we might all think is elections. But one of the complications there, as we all know, is that if the president himself has a vested interest in sort of gaming the electoral process, then even elections become a very hard thing to use against a president. And one of the things that's common in Trump's case through both of his impeachments is he was trying to game the election. In the first time, he was trying to get the Ukraine's president to make up a story that Ukraine was just investigating political corruption by Joe Biden, even though there was no evidence of it. Trump just wanted the announcement. That was an attempt to sort of game the system. In the next scenario, obviously Donald Trump wanted to upend the inauguration of Joe Biden. There's no secret. We all saw it on TV. We all heard it. We all experienced it. And so Trump was trying, in a sense, to undo an election which had just happened, and it just didn't go his way. And what we saw is Congress didn't have whatever it took to stand up to oppose that. And to stand up really in favor of its own prerogatives. That means there's a real challenge going forward with keeping a president in check.
Interesting. And this last 3 weeks, we've been looking at Article 1, Article 2, and next week is Article 3, because we really need to understand the entire system and how it works together with we the people, and how these checks and balances work and how the system is playing out today. One final question, which I absolutely love, and it's Ashnay and Cam both asked this. In your crystal ball, it's so funny. So many historians get crystal ball questions, but I love it. In your like crystal ball, magic 8-ball questioning, when do you think the next will be the first female president? That's the $1 million question from our students. I love it.
I wish I knew the answer. You know, obviously, I hope it's sooner rather than later. But it's hard to know for sure, and I hate to tell you why. And that is because I think thus far in our country, both exercising and vindicating women's rights has not been easy. And it remains difficult. And it extends to the difficulty that any woman would have as a presidential candidate, because any woman as a presidential candidate faces challenges no male faces. And that's a difficulty. Now, it may well get done. At some point, Kamala Harris may well run for the presidency. And we don't quite know, how that might fare, because these are very difficult things to figure out. But we do know when Hillary Clinton ran, there were things she had to face that men don't face as candidates. A woman who's strong, who's intelligent, forceful, may be criticized for that. A man who had those same traits may be praised for it. That's just an extra challenge that a presidential candidate has to face. We all know that. So I think something would have to change demographically in order for us to be able to ultimately envision that a woman becomes president. It seems inevitable. It seems the right thing to do at some point. And of course it is. If we, the people, is not just broad and it has been extending itself over time, and that's a great thing. But at some point, we, the people, have to be broad enough to be able to elect somebody that looks, in fact, like we, the people.
Awesome. And that's what Warren had said in the chat. And I love always ending on the power of we the people and the role of we the people in this democratic system and in our republic. So thank you so much for that conversation today. Thank you for walking us through all those presidents. We all had so many questions, and you're right, some of them could be their entire own class. But this was a great conversation today. We really appreciate it. And Jeff, I'll turn it back to you for any kind of wrap-up thoughts.
Just to thank Michael so much for spreading so much light about the presidency. Friends, thanks for a wonderful Friday discussion. And please be sure to check out Michael's books on Lincoln's mentors and the forgotten presidents. Thank you, Michael, and have a great weekend. All.
Great honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad the students had fun. And I'm sorry I couldn't weave your question in there. So next time the kids come, let me know. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Vicki. Good luck packing. Have fun. Oh, good. And Ashley, I'm glad I got your question in at the end. I was trying to work it in. No worries, Colin. That was okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. I'm going to